In this podcast, I'm going to be talking about the base gear that you will need in order to go fishing with a particular example in mind. And if you haven't followed the first podcast in the series, link to it below. And that's a very important podcast and is all advice that I would have given myself when I started off fishing. So let's get into it. So, like I said, this goes off the previous podcast. That podcast was about you walk up to a spot, regardless of where it is, and you figure it out based off just looking at stuff and based off what you see. So I'm going to take that principle or that concept, I'm going to apply it to the gear. So now you're ready to go buy some gear and you go throw an example into it. The example I'm going to throw in is like a light tackle saltwater example, more or less universal. Good rule of thumb for light tackle saltwater, but it's not going to be, it's not going to be a set in stone rule. Like if there's structure nearby, you might want to go something a bit heavier, as I mentioned in that podcast. So that being said, so let me give you an example the way I see it. Near my apartment, there's this park. This park has steps that go down to the water, and it is open water. Like there's no, what I mean by open water is there's no like structure. There's not like open ocean, as most people refer to it as. There's no structure, no rocks, no jetties for a good chunk of area. So it's an open water scenario, and it's 3 foot. Usually it's off colored, and it's like a sandy or muddy bottom. That is more or less the clues. And when you walk up and down that park, you can sometimes see mullet. I've seen sea turtles there a couple times. You can sometimes see houndfish, which are basically these long, needly things. At a smaller size, they might be a bait for like a larger, like redfish or something. But at a larger size, nah, I wouldn't try imitating. There are some smaller little minnows that are about an inch long, inch and a half long, and there's maybe some like other like crab stuff on the bottom that I can't see, but that is what I'm looking at. That gives me several clues. Like I mentioned that podcast before, that gives me several clues just by looking at that stuff, what I need to go buy. First things first, mullet. I need to go imitate those mullet. That will limit the colors of the lures you're looking at to a very small selection in the store. And in fact, a lot of time you will have like local retail stores will, since they can't carry everything, they will carry the few key colors or the few key styles of baits that everyone's like to throw in that coast. The other thing, off-colored water. I will throw that's another key clue. That will determine another different kind of color you're going to want. So so right off the bat, just looking at your water clarity and looking at the bait you are fishing with or you're trying to imitate gives you what you need to know. And because it's open water, it's a different style of fishing than if you were to fish for something that's tucking right next to the structure. I did a whole podcast on that, stripers versus gulpers. The link to that should be below. And basically, that's all about, there's 2 different kinds of feeding habits, more or less, sportfish. By knowing you're dealing with open water, you're dealing with stuff that will chase down those bait fish. For example, those houndfish will do something very similar. They want something flashy at a distance, they come up and they hit it. Speckled trout might do the same thing. That being said, have that in mind. So now that you have done this, great. What do you actually do? So there is a basic fishing kit that I would have for light tackle saltwater for a scenario like this. You're first going to want a bait setup, just for stuff that scavenges around, might catch bait. So yeah, I've seen people catch hardheads and other scavenger type bait fish in this area. So you want to throw just like a light bait fishing rig, something that you can just soak out a bait and use those tactics with it. For that, out here is a bit weird because we use 3/0 hooks for even our smaller stuff. But like on the California, but a universal hook that you can also use in, say, California and use here. I'd probably go about 2 or a 4. And just if you're using shrimp here, just use a really small piece of shrimp. If you're using if you're on the California coast and you say squid, just take off the tentacle or one of the fins of the squid, and that on its own, soak that out. That's a perfectly fine bait to go use. I've caught plenty of fish, plenty of rays on that, no problem. So you're gonna want to have a hook. You're gonna want to have smallish swivels and half-ounce sinkers. And understand, I'm doing this. Actually, I'm just gonna go this way. So terminal gear first, then. So that's just a basic bait rig that I'll cover later. How to rig up. So you're gonna have hooks for your bait fishing. Hooks, swivels, sinkers, half-ounce, quarter-ounce. For that, it's 3 foot of water. So you're not gonna need an ounce, ounce and a half. And if you really, really need to, like if it's really choppy out there, you can just put 2 half-ounces together and that'll work just fine. So my advice: get yourself like a lighter egg sinker, like I said, that quarter-ounce or half-ounce. Get yourself a lighter size, and just if you really need to double it, double it. And so that's your bait fishing gear with whatever frozen bait you can obtain. I would go with 2 different kinds of lures. You're not trying to break the bank on having all different kinds of fishing lures, but you want some stuff to work with in case you cannot get a hold of bait. You don't want to have bait, whatever the reason may be. First things first, a soft plastic and a jig head. This is an 1/8 ounce I just found. I have in my hand right here. Quarter-ounce would probably be a good size for like light tackle inshore fishing, especially on the gear the rod and reel I'm gonna go over later in this podcast. Quarter-ounce, good. It's good size to throw. And soft plastics, you could either go with a grub or you go with a swim bait. I would not recommend a soft jerk bait, even though I love using them. The reason for it is because I want someone to have a bait that can both be bounced off the bottom, and you could also move it in the middle of the water column. So you could use it as both. So that way, if that's all you're trying to work with, that's that. So yeah, I'd get one of those different kinds of soft plastics, and I'd imitate it to whatever bait fisher stuff you see. If you see smallish mullet, imitate the small mullet. So on and so forth. If you see blue crabs on the bottom of this, you could even try to get like a blue crab plastic, even though it breaks that rule, and just throw it on the jig head, or you get even if you get like a blue crab-ish color on a swim bait, that'll work just fine. In California, we'll do that all the time. I've seen guys take a kelp crab themed bait, and I'll do the same colors as well, a kelp crab themed bait, and they will fish a swim bait that has the color of a crab, which is normally not what you're supposed to do, because normally a swim bait's supposed to imitate a bait fish. And on the contrary, I've heard of guys fishing with tubes that imitate bait fish, which normally meant to imitate like a bottom bouncing type thing. So in my opinion, color is more of a imitator than the actual bait itself. So yeah, if you can just get a basic kind of soft plastic with the color that goes with it. Next up, you're going to need so we've covered your bait fishing gear. We've covered your soft plastic gear. Next up, you're going to want something that's a lure you can fish subsurface. It's a little hard bait. This is a bit large for what I recommend for starting off with, but if you could find like a little 2.5, 3-inch twitch bait, that'll be great. It'll be heavy enough that you could throw it on the gear I'm going to recommend, but it'll be small enough to where you can just get whatever's there. If those houndfish are feeding on relatively small bait, that'll work just fine in that example I showed you. And those houndfish, they might just take one swipe at it, and they might just take one quick pop at it. So that being said, like I've seen houndfish, like they'll follow all the time, let's go pop. So you want treble hooks to where they could just hold on to it much better. A single hook, they might miss it, they might break your plastic. So just have both. Gives you also just something to work with, gives you a little bit of changing up. Next off is going to be rod, reel, and line. I did not. Normally, you're supposed to cover rod, reel, and line first, and then you cover your terminal gear. So rod, reel, and line, I like to. So for a light tackle, 10-pound mono is just fine. And a quick thing with lines. Well, first of all, lines, if you know how to make a healthy setup, so rod, reel, and line all together, you can balance out a setup when you practice and you learn how to do it. It makes all the difference. Just a basically balanced setup. So when I mentioned one, all three should go together like that. So yeah, like I said, for this, 10-pound mono is good because it is so basically, so 10-pound mono is good because it's heavy enough that it has some durability. I've almost landed 20-pound skates on 10-pound mono, so there's no problem with it. Only reason why I lost it is because it went around a rock, cut me off. So yeah, it won't be heavy enough to where you could work with like a lot of heavy structure, like a jetty or something, right next to a jetty. But open sand area, not a problem. 10-pound mono is good because also it's light enough. It's sensitive. You're going to get more bites on 10 versus 20. Everyone knows that. That's a common thing in the fishing world. You're going to get more bites on 10 versus 20. And when I release the largemouth fish, I get more bites on 4 versus 6. And I get more bites on 6 than the guy who'd use 10 or 12 for the same thing. And there are some weird exceptions, but more or less that's it. So once you have that in mind, your 10-pound mono, and the other reason for mono is going back to the basics of line, for those of you who don't know. There's 3 different kinds of line, more or less, on the market. There's some weird mixes and stuff, but there's 3 basics. Monofilament, or mono as I'm calling it, fluorocarbon, and braid. Fluorocarbon is invisible under the water, so it's great for super clear water, and it has no stretch. Meaning, when you pull on it, just nothing gives, and it has no So that being said, it has no forgiveness. Braid has no forgiveness, and it's basically tightly woven line, but it's super visible. So 30-pound braid is the equivalent to, say, an 8 or 10-pound mono. That's the thing. That's why everyone likes using braid. But I would not recommend braid right off the bat because it has no stretch. Second, a fish wants to not fight easy on you, you're gonna have to fight against that fish in a challenging way because you don't have any stretch as forgiveness when you're just learning. You're just learning how to fight a fish. Versus mono has a decent amount of stretch, is relatively clear, and is dirt cheap. To put that in perspective, mono is going to be a fraction of the price of the other two. So to put it this way, I went to Walmart and I got myself a spool of 10-pound that I just need to quickly grab for like $2, maybe $3. If you add a little bit of tax here and there, a little under $3. But yeah, and it was 700 yards of just cheap 10-pound mono. So you don't need to break the bank buying yourself a fresh spool of mono, which I definitely recommend, even if you already have mono on the spool, because they might use a crummy line or whatever. So just have a nice backup spool. You can get thousands of yards for $10. So it is a dirt cheap replacement. If you need to, you get spooled, something happens. Oh well. Although I doubt if you're trying to start off with catching smaller fish, getting spooled probably won't be your problem. If you get frays, your line gets crusty, but yeah. So just have a nice spool of mono ready, 10-pound. Reel size for that light tackle saltwater, about a 3,000 size is good. 4,000 is a little bit too large. It just depends on the brand. I have bought a 30 or a 3,000, just so you know, spinning rods and reels are measured in numbers. So either 30s, either in the 10s or the thousands. So like a 1,000 is more than a 2,000, so on and so forth. All the way to, I think it's like a 20,000 size, which is bigger than a child's head. So, but we don't need 20,000 size reel. You just need to catch small fish and learn your basics. You need a 3,000 size reel. I've seen people just with cheap kits will go out there with a 5,000 size. With little kids, it doesn't really work. It's too bulky. It's a pain in the rear to hold. You're going to want to use that lighter gear, that 10-pound and that 3,000 size reel. And 3,000 is usually meant to hold 10-pound mono. And just if you don't know if it's the right size reel, just take a look at it before you buy it. They will tell you it is like it will tell you this number of like pound test to this amount of line capacity for it. If it has 10-pound in there, it is good to go. So if it's meant for if it says 10-pound on it, like 10 pounds, say 200 yards, or 10-pound 150 yards, something like that, 120 yards, you're good to go. Like I say, you don't need a whole lot of line because you're probably not going to get spooled. You're not trying to make the biggest cast. You're just trying to get your basics out. Rod. Just a rod that matches it. The best way to tell on a rod is it will basically show you so let me put it this way. So a rod will let you know all kinds of details about it just by reading the description on the bottom of the rod. If you can learn to master reading that, you are good to go. So they will tell you things like medium heavy, 6'6". These are all just random things you'll hear, and you'll wonder what they mean. Longer rod. So I'll break down a few different things. I'll break down rod length and line recommendation for it. Is more or less how it's set up. Line weight is what they call it. So rod length. What does that mean? Shorter rod is usually more accurate. Longer rod is usually going to be more distance. Think of like a catapult arm. You're going to have a shorter catapult arms. You're going to get more accuracy with it. It's meant for shorter range stuff, but it's not going to get the distance that a longer armed, more momentum that longer catapult is going to get. Hence why a surf fishing rod is usually 12. It's like a 12 or 10-foot rod. So that's that. And with that point, you're looking at that open water. You're going to want something that's 7 foot. 7 foot's pretty easy to find. You're going to get a good sized cast with it. 6.5 is the shorter end of that. I would not go any shorter than maybe 6'6". I just don't feel comfortable with going anything shorter than 6'6". If you have a little kid, a 6-foot rod might be fine for him because it'd be more balanced. A 6 foot would be at the shorter end. I would not go anything shorter than 6 foot because you'll have a miserable time casting. You ever see those little Barbie combos? You only reason why you buy one is you burn it right after because they're maybe 2 foot long. So what ends up happening is you don't get a real cast out there. They're a pain in the rear to cast. Even like I'll borrow one from someone and I can't even cast the thing. So I would not recommend a setup that I don't even use. But your general 6.5, 7 foot rod you could find for 20. You could possibly, with a combo together, a rod reel, you could probably find for like $30, $25, $30. And now let me clarify something. Spinning gear. You're gonna want to look for spinning gear. How do you tell the difference? Spinning gear on a rod will have a massive guide first, closest to the reel, and will quickly move off to a really small guide. A casting rod will start off with a relatively small guide and not change very much as it goes down. Spinning reels, they basically have a longer, let's call it a neck, but not really. It's not actually meant to be a neck, which is a piece basically between where it sits on the rod and the actual, where all the gears are, the reel and your handle and everything else. And the spinning reel, there's also a wire that makes a half circle and is all exposed. There's a couple advantages to a beginner. One, it is easier to cast than a bait caster, but not as easy as a spin casting setup. The trade-off, though, is it is easier to manage, in my opinion, to work the basic gearings of, to tie stuff with, to re-rig on, to fix a spool with. It's easier, in my opinion, to work with a spinning reel than it is with a spin cast reel. Spin cast reel will be like when you found those like Frozen or Barbie combos or whatever. And the other advantage is a spinning setup can cast lighter baits on average because there's not as much resistance to it. It is an open. There's nothing resisting that line as it goes out to make when you make that cast. That being said, you now have a perfectly long cast, or you don't have a perfectly long cast, but if you're using those little light quarter-ounce baits and you're just getting started into casting, you're not going to want something that's super complex to work with. You're just going to want to practice with the basics, and this is all good gear to work with. Even I will use gear that I mentioned here. Like I said, I would not recommend something that I do not know myself. That all this being said, this is gear that you can take out to a light saltwater scenario, and you can basically modify it. Or you could my advice is before you buy any more gear than what I recommend here, except for, of course, if you get snagged and you want to buy a new bag of plastics or a new bag of lures, but more or less, if you want to just practice with this stuff, it is totally fine to go do it until you know your way around catching fish and you know what you're doing. The moment that you have this set of gear and you know what you're doing with it, and you have a level of confidence, you have essentially mastered what's in your hands, then you go on to other stuff. You first, all this gear right here works well, so start off with it. Do not venture with a whole lot of different kinds of fancy gear, because then otherwise you'll be spending a couple $100 on what should be a $30 to $50 learning curve. Alright, if you guys like this stuff, please give it a like, subscribe if you are not already subscribed, leave a comment how experienced you are as a fishing family person, and if you like this kind of stuff, if you like beginner intro type fishing content. All right. Take care, guys.